So the video we're going to do today is going to cover building epoxy forms. I'm going to do a couple different scenarios in this video. So if the first scenario doesn't really fit what you're looking for, skip ahead later in the video and you'll see more of a form that applies to river tables, full castings, pours where you have full voids going through your material that require backing of some sort, things like that. This stuff is pretty simple once you do it once or twice. There's not a whole lot to it, but there also isn't a whole lot of information out there on it. So that's why I'm trying to do some videos for people that are just beginning or wanting to try it for the first time. Most of what you're gonna need is real basic stuff. You'll probably have most of it laying around your shop. If you don't, very inexpensive to go out and buy the materials you need. Hopefully it helps. I'll try to keep it short, sweet, and to the point and not let it get too wordy as best I can while still covering everything. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or other things that you'd like to have covered, shoot me a message, leave a comment. I'm happy to help any way I can. These are the basics of what you're gonna need to build these forms. Sheathing tape. I use tuck tape, works well. Tyvek brand tape also works. Really any sheathing tape you can get your hands on from your hardware or the big box stores works. Epoxy won't stick to this stuff. This is what you're gonna use to create the barrier between your casting resin and the actual form itself, so everything releases once it's done. Pocket hole jig is really handy to have for this, not completely necessary. Hot glue gun, some silicone caulk gun, your scrap wood or whatever wood you're gonna use to actually build your form. The size of the project dictates that. The scenario it's in is gonna dictate that. So you're just gonna have to kind of feel your way through that because there's not one size fits all. You're gonna need some various fasteners, screws, different things like that. Probably a couple of clamps, and a nice flat level working surface. And that should get you going. The first scenario I'm gonna cover is for something along these lines where you have a crack or a void that goes through the full thickness of the material, but doesn't go the full length of the material. So all we have to do is create a backer board for the backside and a board for the end to hold the resin where we want it. First step in the process is going to be cutting your form boards. We need to cover this area here that I've outlined in a marker at a minimum. A little bit bigger is better. You'll also need a board, something to go on the end of that you'll fasten to your backer board as well as the material itself if you can. That's ideal. It helps create a better seal for when you pour. You'll also wrap your form boards, everything that's going to touch epoxy again, in the sheathing tape. It's an absolute must. If you don't, you're going to glue everything together. The next step in the process is going to be doing your dry fit with your form and your workpiece. Once you've got your form boards cut and everything's covered in the sheathing tape, this is where you're going to drill your holes to secure anything you need to. That's where the pocket hole jig comes in handy. It puts a down and inward pressure up against your workpiece, helps hold it into place and create a better seal with your workpiece and your backing board. Something else to keep in mind, you have to find a way to secure your workpiece from moving. Obviously, once you pour this, you don't want it moving, and you also don't want it moving once the silicone's in there curing up. Your work surface needs to be big, flat, clean, and absolutely level. That's crucial for a good epoxy pour, is a level working surface. Another option you're gonna have, let's say you got a big dining room table that's split after you build it, or something where you don't have the ability to really bring a workpiece on a nice level working surface somewhere, you gotta go to the work. The other option you have is you can cut a smaller backing board, go right over your crack or your void, and actually screw it to the bottom of the workpiece if it's not going to be an issue doing that. If you don't have to worry about seeing the screw holes, this is probably the most ideal situation because it's mechanically fastened to the workpiece. Once you complete your dry fit, it's time for final assembly. The first thing that you're going to do is run a bead of silicone where I've got this Sharpie laid out. You want to keep your silicone back from your void because once you flip this over and set it down, that silicone is going to squish out or expand a little bit, and you don't want that going in your void. You're going to do the same thing on the end for your end board. Keep it back from the void to help create that seal for your end board. After you apply your silicone, you'll set it down on your backboard and you'll secure the workpiece however you got to do that. Then before putting your end board on the bottom, run a bead of silicone with the face that's going to make contact with your backer board. That will create the seal along the bottom and then up the sides. So you'll put that in place, you'll secure it, then you let this sit for 24 hours so that silicone is good and cured up. That creates your seal all the way around all sides. The Then the last step you're gonna do is where the hot glue gun comes in handy. Now you can do this step with the silicone, it just takes longer to dry. But what I do is I run a bead of hot glue as close as you can to your void that you're getting ready to fill, all the way around. Now what that does is that creates a little bit of a basin on the top side, because if you've never poured epoxy, you have to over pour things. It does shrink back some, so keep that in mind. But this creates kind of a safety catch for your epoxy. If you pour it too fast or you overfill, it doesn't run everywhere. The other thing too is if you have uneven material, you may have to fill one side a little more to get a high side up to being completely filled, or vice versa. So that's where the hot glue gun comes in handy, but you can also do that with the silicone. It just takes a little longer to cure. The next scenario I'm going to cover is probably the most common one that everybody does. This is the one where you're doing river tables or big pours where you're encasing something completely in epoxy, where you essentially need a complete pool to fill up with whatever material you have in it. There's a few more steps to this one, but it's still the same concept. The first step in building this form is going to be cutting your form boards, the side boards, and your backer board. As far as the backer board goes, I would recommend at least 5/8 or thicker material, so that way you've got a good square sturdy base that you can build off. Your side boards can be 3/4 inch, I would say at least. You don't want to go much thinner, especially if you're using pocket hole jig. It gets a little squirrely. Always cut your form bigger than you need. You want to be able to pour this a little bit bigger than your final dimensions, so you got room to square things up or cut out some nasty spots if the pour got away from you. There's nothing worse than pouring a project and having to cut this thing down worse than what you really wanted to. Something else to keep in mind is your depth. Make sure you build these sideboards tall enough to get the full depth that you're going to need. Whether you're running it through a planer or sanding it afterwards, you want to make sure you got a little bit extra. It never hurts. This is where the pocket hole jig comes in handy. After you've got your form boards cut, drill some pocket holes if that's an option for you to help, and that's what you'll use to secure all this together. If you don't have that, it's not the end of the world, but you've got to find some way to secure these side form boards to your backer board to create a rigid frame that you can use as a basin to pour your epoxy. The next thing you're going to do is a dry fit. Once you got all your boards cut, wrap them in the sheathing tape. Anything that's going to be in contact with epoxy, your sideboards, your backer boards, and ideally the work surface you're working on, in case you get any leaks or you spill some, it's easier to manage and clean up. If you don't cover everything that's going to be in contact with epoxy in this pour with this sheathing tape, I promise you will glue everything together and you're going to have a mess on your hands. So be very aware of that as you're doing this process. Once you've got everything set in place, that's where you'll figure out where you need to drill your pocket hole screws if you haven't already done that, or however you're going to fasten your sideboards down to your backer boards. You're also going to drill some holes in the sides here to fasten these sideboards to the end boards, and same on this side. That way you create some extra rigidity in your frame so that nothing can move, and it helps pull everything together for a good tight seal. This is probably the most crucial step in the whole process. The last thing you're going to do is make sure your work surface is completely level and clean. If the work surface is not level, this stuff seeks its own level just like water does. So you have to be aware of that as well before you go to pour. After the dry fit, it's time for final assembly. One of the biggest benefits of doing a dry fit is obviously to make sure everything fits well, but what it does is however you're going to secure everything together, it pre-drills your holes. It gives you pilot holes so this stage goes smoother because it's going to be a multi-step process. So once you've got everything fitting and you've removed all your screws and fasteners from your dry fit, you're going to take all these side form boards and flip them over. You're going to run a bead of silicone down the bottom of each one that's going to make contact with this backer board, and that's going to create a seal on your bottom to your backer board. The other thing you're also going to do is on two of the pieces, whichever it may be, you're going to run a bead of silicone up the ends of them that are going to make contact with your sideboards. And what that does is that now creates your seal going up the form. So everything will be sealed and watertight. So one at a time, run your beads, flip them over, secure them down in those pre-drilled holes. That's where everything goes fast. Same thing with your sides. After you've got your bottom silicone and up the sides, Secure those all together. Now your form is built. We just have to do some final touches of silicone to ensure that we've got everything covered. Another thing you're going to want to do when you're doing this final assembly of your form is on the inside of these forms, run a bead of silicone on the inside, down along the bottom and up all the sides. That just adds one more layer of protection. You just need a little bit, then smooth it out with your finger. You don't want it protruding or leaving big gobs in there, because then when you put your workpiece in there, it's not going to fit right. You can do the same thing along the outsides if you feel it's necessary, down along the bottom and up the sides. It never hurts to have a little extra silicone, because if you got a form that leaks, you're going to wish you did it. After your silicone's completely cured, I recommend 24 hours at least. A couple days wouldn't hurt. It's time to put your piece in and pour. The last piece of advice I'm going to give you: material can float in resin when you pour it, so you got to find some way to secure it down. A quick way to do that is just to have some blocks, however many you think you may need depending on the size of your project. Put them on there, another piece of wood with tape to span the gap, and secure it down. Screws, clamps, whatever you got. If something like this is not feasible, or you're not able to do this, same thing, put some blocks on there and just put some weight on it. Anything you can do to hold this down so when you pour it, the material doesn't float up. Pro tip: if you are using these blocks and you're doing anything with bigger voids or anywhere that these have potential to be down in the epoxy when you pour it as it comes up, don't do that. You do not want to bridge gaps with these blocks or have these down in the epoxy in any way, shape, or form. You'll trap air under here and you'll never get it out. It'll damn near ruin your project every time, so don't do that. Make sure they're either off to the sides on the material itself or in an area that you plan on trimming off anyway, and it doesn't really matter.